Okay, so I can see numbers are sort of settling of participants now, so maybe we will get started. Hello, I'm Helen Kennedy. I'm the director of the ESRC Digital Good Network. I'm here with my colleague Roz. Do you want to introduce yourself, Roz?
Hi, everybody. My name's Ros Williams. I'm the Associate Director of the network. Lovely to see you all here.
Brilliant. Thanks, Roz. So this is the first in a webinar series of the ESRC Digital Good Network, which we are launching now and will continue to run over the next couple of years for the rest of the duration of the network. This webinar kind of frames a lot of the work of the Digital Good Network. It's called Reflecting on the Challenges of Asking Normative Questions about the Digital Society that We Want. Just so that you know what's coming up. On the 21st of May, we have a webinar by Professor Dylan Yamada Rice, who's received funding from us on children's attitudes towards notions of digital good, bad. And on the 18th of June, we have a webinar by Dr. Lexi Webster, who's also received funding from us entitled Queer Joy as Digital Good. So the Digital Good Network focuses on the question, what does a good digital society look like and how do we get there? We prioritise three societal challenges: equity, sustainability and resilience, because we believe that a good digital society will share many of the characteristics of a good society. And we do some research ourselves in the core management team, but we also distribute funding to support other research projects, international fellowships, PhD internships, PhD summer school, and other training and masterclass activities as well. So here we are doing network type things, being a network. So Ros and I will talk for maybe 30 to 35 minutes today, and then we'll have some space for some Q&A. And obviously what we're doing on the Digital Good Network is we are asking normative questions. What kind of digital society do we want? Informed by our understandings, perhaps, of the kind of digital society that we don't want. And this is a normative question. It asks us to make value judgments, and that's complicated. So we're going to reflect on those challenges today. So we ask what a good digital society looks like and how we get there. We take as our starting point the very many critiques of digital technologies that are around and exist today, especially informed by social sciences, that acknowledge the problems that arise when social media platforms, biometric surveillance data, generative AI are deployed, unleashed on society. There's a lot of criticism, right, of what might go wrong, of the harms. And these criticisms show us the contours of the digital society that we don't want. What we don't want becomes clear. This is really important, absolutely foundational to the work that we're doing, and it is only a start. So on the Digital Good Network, we're taking the next analytical step in line with a vein of scholarship that asks us to imagine more desirable futures. So we shift from what we don't want to this question of what we do want. So this involves unpacking this kind of concept of the good. Um, and we acknowledge that our chosen terms, good, sustainable, equitable, resilient, they're all controversial. They're all understood in different ways by different actors. They open some things up, they close some things down. And over the past 2 years, we've undertaken, as I've said, sort of a lot of activity to to kind of address these terms, to acknowledge the ways in which they're challenging, to consider the ways in which they might be helpful. So what me and Ros talk about today is not our own amazing research, it's the amazing research of people in our network and how that has kind of informed our thinking. So we'll reflect on some of these challenges of asking normative questions. We'll explain our decision to do so. We'll reflect on how and why these questions matter, past, present, and future. We'll hone in a little bit on equity, and we'll conclude by thinking about category errors and heuristics, some sort of social science terms that some of you may be familiar with. So to start by unpacking the good, as I've said, what good means is not straightforward. There is very little consensus about it, even though a lot of actors, say in government, civil society, mobilize the term good in digital for social good type initiatives. So you might have data for social good, statistics for social good, for example. So what's wrong with the term good? What have people said? What criticisms have people directed at this term? Well, one criticism is that ideas about the good life are dominated by global north narratives, despite extensive thinking on this topic happening elsewhere in the world. As is often the case, the views of people from disadvantaged or underrepresented groups are rarely taken into account when we think about this notion of the good. So, for example, our Digital Good Network core team member, Jonathan Ong, has worked with others to produce the report you can see on this slide here, where they argue that global North-led tech for good initiatives are top-down, tools and tech first, and that they result in what they describe as the illusion of inclusion, because global North perspectives on what good looks like dominate initiatives taking place in global majority countries without considering what citizens of those countries might think about this concept of the good. And similar arguments are made by Mirka Maggiano in her book, Techno-Colonialism, When Technology for Good is Harmful. So there's politics at play here. The term good is used for political goals, with different people reaching for the concept of the good in order to advance their aims. And because these politics are at play, for some commentators, the term good is kind of not political enough. So, for example, in the context of talking about data and AI systems, the adjective good, like fair, is seen here by Kaluri as infinitely spacious, an infinitely spacious term that any AI system can be squeezed into. So anyone can describe their AI system as fair, anyone can describe it as good. What Kaluri argues, and others like her, is that things like justice and equity should be what we're striving for, not these vaguer, ill-defined notions like the good, which might be open to misuse or goodness washing of still harmful technologies, argued to be good when in fact they are not. However, it's worth noting that empirical research with diverse members of the public has found that terms like good and fair on the one hand, just and equitable on the other, are not as distinct as critical commentators propose, at least for people impacted by tech developments. Actually, they're interwoven with each other, and talking about the social good can be a way of expressing concern about digital injustices and inequities. So the term good is not only problematic, as critical commentators suggest, it can also be a useful tool for talking about the politics of things like data and AI, and for considering experiences of people from groups different from our own. So, aware of these criticisms, Charlton McIlwain, who's the author of Black Software and a member of the Digital Good Network's College of Experts, asked this question: digital good, comma, enough, question mark. Is digital good enough? Is it a good enough concept? In a keynote annual lecture that he gave for us. And he drew distinctions between different types of doing good. So doing good for, he said, is like white saviorism, the imposition by philanthropy and outside experts of their version of the good on communities they perceive to be in need. like the Tech for Good initiatives that Jonathan Ong and others criticised. So better than doing good for, Charlton McElwain argued, is doing good with, which he likened to allyship, actively supporting people from disadvantaged groups in ways that respect lived experiences. Better yet, McElwain argues, is doing good by, which he sees as a form of kind of relinquishing control. So not only providing resources to people underrepresented in or excluded from digital society decision making, but handing control over to them of how resources are deployed and how good is defined. And in the lecture that he gave, Lexi Webster, who is going to give one of our webinars in a couple of months' time, added to the list doing good as. So that is communities doing good for, with, and as themselves. So this slide alone, I think, shows how complex, context-dependent, contested, and inherently political this notion of a good digital society can be. So why do we bother carrying on using it? So what good does good do? Well, we argue that despite these challenges, asking this question of what a good digital society looks like, or using this concept of the digital good, is still important for a number of reasons. So another one of our College of Expert members, Susan Holford, noted that the concept of the digital good has what she described as convening power. What that means is it's potentially inclusive with regard to who would join a conversation, who's willing to sit around the table, and so enables us to maybe talk to powerful policymakers and industry practitioners at the same time as talking to civil society groups or diverse citizens from minoritized groups or communities. It could be transformative. It could inch us towards what Rua Benjamin describes as the worlds we cannot live without. And even if we don't arrive at a good digital society, the fact that it's transformative, that it might inch us towards something better, reminds me, at least, of the motto of the web accessibility movement. It's the journey, not the destination. So they would argue that it's not about achieving absolute web accessibility for all, but it's about the process of trying to get there. So the digital good is a rich object of study for all the reasons I've described. It's contested, it's political, it's context dependent. It's not a given or taken for granted that we all know what we're talking about. It's actually something we should be studying. So Kaluri describes good as infinitely spacious, and its infinite spaciousness makes it an object of study, makes it able to accommodate what might be described as polyvocality. So different voices can come together in the concept. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to bring sectors, disciplines, communities, groups together in what might be seen as a kind of model in the making for how a group of people with multiple interests might identify and work towards the digital society we want. So to give an example of that, here's a bunch of projects that we have funded. So hopefully they give a sense of the diverse voices, diverse kind of visions of a good digital society that we're bringing together. So I guess I also want to argue that there are many aligned concepts out there to the work that we're doing on a good digital society. So I'm going to talk about three such concepts, and then I'm going to hand over to Roz. So the first aligned concept is hope. So in the 1950s, Ernst Bloch wrote in Principles of Hope that utopian thinking is critical to building a better society. So hope as a kind of what's described as praxis, that's theory plus action. So he says there is a will within hope. a will that it should be so, it must become so, things must change. And as we can see on this slide, more recently, one of my all-time favourite books that I managed to squeeze into everything I think and write about is J.K. Gibson's Graham's Post-Capitalist Politics, which starts with the 5 really compelling words, "This is a hopeful book." And what they argue is that in certain fields, in certain social science fields, in media, culture and communication studies, which they're located in, these fields privilege critique and then are underwritten by what they describe as a deep-seated negativity. And so they argue that in this context, hope itself is transgressive. It's a kind of critical intervention. And they see hope enacted in their book about a post-capitalist politics. They're actually mapping a range of already existing strategies to build economic structures distinct from capitalist models, and so open up a politics of possibility. So the actual sort of real world examples in this book written almost 20 years ago that they draw on. Another aligned concept that we might think about alongside the notion of a good digital society is the concept of promise. And we think here of Payal Arora's recent book, From Pessimism to Promise, Lessons from the Global South in Designing Inclusive Tech. And what Aurora argues is that the West is suffering from pessimism paralysis. And she argues that negativity has never inspired change. So she proposes that pessimism is a Western privilege. Like Gibson Graham, she notes that it's difficult to critique, to critique criticisms because you're looked on as kind of naive or apolitical. But she goes on, it's not naive to be optimistic about our digital futures. In fact, we have a moral imperative to design digital texts with hope. And another thing she says is that kind of critique about digital tech is often not supported by empirical data from the global south. So that criticism is kind of undermined when we look at empirical data from the global south. So she says we need to counter message, such as the counter messages, such as those embedded in concepts like data colonialism, which tend to imply that feeling empowered in any way by a digital platform means that we have a kind of colonial mindset. And so the third concept that is mobilized at present that we think is relevant to the work that we are doing is the notion of imagination. And here we can use the example of Rua Benjamin's recent short book, Imagination, a Manifesto. So where Benjamin argues that imagination should be taken seriously as a space where the future might get reshaped. And she argues it's essential for social change. It's a powerful resource for collective liberation. Because in order to change the world, we must first have a vision in mind. And for her, collective imagination means refusing narratives that maintain the status quo and crafting new stories, in contrast to dominant imaginings that often present themselves as universal. Mobilizing collective imaginings requires that we turn to creative means. And so Benjamin celebrates the creativity of various Black artists, which she says has been required now and in the past to get through the intolerable here and nows of Black folks in the US by conceiving of something else and something other. And there's a lot of alignment in what Benjamin argues for and our interest. So I was really delighted to see Benjamin write about Ubuntu philosophy, Buen Vivir philosophy, and Afrofuturism in her book, because of the first round of projects that we funded through our Digital Good Research Fund. Of the 9 projects, 3 of them map on directly to these concepts. So I feel very reassured by that alignment there. So Ubuntu an African philosophy which emphasizes the interconnectedness of people and their responsibilities to each other and the environment came up in this project. The first one here, digital health. Buen vivir, or good living, a concept which subordinates economic objectives to the criteria of human dignity, social justice, and ecology, came up on Indigenia, a project about generative AI and indigenous futures. And Afrofuturism, which reimagines, reinterprets, and reclaims the past through a Black cultural lens, was the focus of a project on reimagining AI with Afrofuturist speculative design. So what we are kind of saying here, as another College of Expert member, Lucas Schultz, said in a keynote talk he gave, is that imagination and critique aren't simply entangled, they are generative of each other. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Roz.
Thanks, Helen. So much of what we do is sort of rooted in the here and now, and it relies, I think, on a body of work that identifies elements of our existing digital society that are not good. But actually, Helen, if you can flip to the next slide, I think our intention is sort of inherently future focused at the network. And in that sense, I think it also has a moral dimension to it. As Helen said earlier, it's normative. So it's asking sort of what kinds of digital societies we do want. And this is really quite distinctive, I think, from asking what kind of digital society we do not want, what we dread, to use the word that occupies David Theo Goldberg, the race scholar, in Facing Futureless Futures. So for Goldberg, digital technology is innately tied into this sort of contemporary disposition of dread toward the future, whether that's like AI and mis and disinformation, datafication, and more. But actually, I want to think a little bit with these ideas of past, future, but also present, by drawing on a range of literature and scholars that have dealt with this in various different ways. So on the next slide, please, Helen. The challenge, I think, is thinking here is sort of getting through the here and now. That's what we think about, or someone like Munoz, for example, would think about. Getting through the here and now is only doable by conceiving of something else, or something different. And this, I think, is what Munoz means when he's referring to this mode of desiring that allows us to see and feel beyond what he describes as the quagmire of the present. He says, the here and now is a prison house, which obviously chimes, I think, with some of the things Roa Benjamin was saying that Helen mentioned earlier. And we must strive in the face of the here and now and its totalizing rendering of reality to think of a there and a then. In other words, imagining the future is not fanciful. So when Audre Lorde writes about seeking a now that can breed futures, that similar directive surfaces, right? We need to think about the future to make the current moment tolerable. And in sociology, I think, we don't do so well at looking to the future. So we have not, according to some, actually been that much better at understanding the past. So to look at how we might think of the future, it actually, I think, could be instructive to look at our treatment of history first. So as the professor of historical sociology, Gominda Bambra, wrote in 2007, social sciences were not founded and cultivated on what she describes as a standard view. Sorry, they were founded and cultivated, I should say, on what she describes as a standard view of modernity, or simply what she describes as modern society. And that standard view didn't, or it couldn't, or it wouldn't accommodate how empire and colonialism were central to shaping the world that we were living in 2007, that we continue to live in today. And for Gominda, for Bambra, what was needed was an acknowledgement of the colonial histories that made up the present. In pursuit of their remedy in the past, we might then be able to build more just political, economic systems. So then if we've got a standard view of history that we could question, that we could push against, that we could decolonize, as is the kind of the parlance of today, could the same be said of our future? I think that's an interesting question to posit. Is there a standard view of the future as colonized as that of the past? So on the next slide, you'll see DuckDuckGo's vision of the future. The one after that, you will see Bing's vision of the future. Pay attention to all of these lovely metal buildings. And on the one after that, you'll see Google's vision of the future. So if you were to think with DuckDuckGo, Bing, or Google's rendering of the future, it is one of glazed metal buildings There is enough here, I think, to see at least one standard view. You might have read and watched enough science fiction in your time to know that this aesthetic doesn't come from thin air, but it's the coalescing of a particular imaginary. But on the next slide, please, Helen, these imagined futures aren't just visual, nor are they just epistemic. We can think about these, after social theorist of time Barbara Adam, as anticipatory regimes that can, quote, conjure many versions of the future. But what all speculations share is the orientation towards and claim to the future as that which matters. So anticipation is not just betting on the future, it's a moral economy, she writes, in which the future sets the conditions of possibility for action in the present, in which the future is inhabited in the present. I think back to my PhD supervisor, Nick Brown, who's a science and technology studies scholar, who was writing about the hype of nanobiotechnology back in 2003. And in this paper, he wrote about futures being performative, fundamental to producing the obligations that are necessary to mobilize resources for an aspiration to be realized. So we're talking about digital technologies together, not, thankfully, nanobiotechnologies back in 2003, but this point still stands. Future imaginaries with sufficient sort of power behind them marshal resources in the present. So who says what the future is? And not just what it'll be made of materially, but its norms or its values, what it ought to be, according to those people who espouse these ideals. We go on to the next slide, please, Helen. The cultural commentator Mark Derry asks, isn't the unreal estate of the future already owned by the technocrats, futurologists, the streamliners and set designers, white to a man, who have engineered our collective fantasies? They provide the standard view, but they do not have to be the only ones. So Helen insisted at some point, I think, that we add Donald Trump to this slide. When I designed this slide, I don't think it had Donald Trump's face on it, but there you go. Four chaps there who have, I think, a lot of power behind them to imagine particular futures, and to some extent have been able to generate those futures in the present, as we're seeing around us even today. In imagination, Ruhr Benjamin cites the think tank Nestor's distinction, which highlights how not all futures are equal. So on the next slide, if we just pop past Donald Trump's face there, Nestor points out the idea of possible futures, plausible futures, probable futures, and preferable futures. In other words, imagined futures are not inevitable. The ideals, the norms and values that coalesce around imagined digital futures are up for grabs. So asking what futures are possible requires us to look past what futures are probable. Susan Lee Starr wrote a very famous essay. For those who don't know her, she's like a kind of a canonical figure in science and technology studies. And in this essay on power, technology, and the phenomenology of conventions, she begins with the story about onions. And in her attempt to fight standardization in a fast food restaurant by declaring her onion allergy, she finds it nearly impossible to have the onions removed from her burger, because there's a standard system for how the burger gets put together by the staff. So you may be thinking, what's Roz talking about a burger for in this webinar about the digital good network? But her paper is really interesting because it also reflects on Bruno Latour's writing on the effectiveness of the door jamb, the mechanism at the top of a door, the closing door apparatus, which, as Latour puts it, works really well to open and close the door, right? It makes sure that the door opens and it makes sure that the door closes. If, as Latour said, you put aside the fact that it takes time to maintain the door jamb to make sure it's effective, and if you put aside those people who can't use the door, perhaps because the door's too narrow for their wheelchair, or perhaps because the door's got too many steps leading up to it and they can't access it. So if you put that aside, the technology works really well. So in this essay, Starr says, when you put these things aside, you make a really big analytical error. Her point is that we shouldn't put aside. The fast food restaurant works really well if one puts aside the people who can't eat fast food with the impunity of not having an onion allergy. It is, for Starr, analytically interesting, but it's also politically just to sniff out the people who do not benefit, the people who do get put aside. And here we can learn from the social science that tells us of all of digital technology's putting asides. With the put aside as our methodological center, we might then ask ourselves, well, what do those put asides imagine of the future? What are those preferable futures for those people? So prioritizing what might be otherwise, what might be preferable. So any presumption of a good digital future is not neutral. It is driven by presumption of a particular set of values, its own political practice. As Barbara Adam put it earlier, anticipation has long been a component of political practice. She mentioned decolonization, Marxism, Ernst Bloch, Marxist, for example, feminism. All of these rely on conjuring the possibility of new futures. And in this sense, the network is itself making a kind of anticipatory intervention into the future and what it ought to look like. We hop onto the next slide, please, Helen. We shouldn't overemphasize the future orientation of the digital good in the here and now. Examples from our funded research demonstrate how the digital good can be built around us right now, not in the far off horizon, but at this minute. So, for example, digital mattering, a philosophical anthropology of mobile messaging as everyday human goodness, considers how goodness might start from the very small building blocks of everyday mundane communication between individuals, their friends, and their family. This can be framed as the foundation of belonging, creating a sense of digital mattering to others. Queer Joy is Digital Good, which Helen mentioned earlier, and which will be one of the upcoming webinars in our DGN webinar series, demonstrates how queer people gather today to build community online. In pursuit of camaraderie and connection, queer participants in that study weren't waiting around for a good future, they were trying to craft it in the present. Actually, as the RA on that project put it in some media coverage of their work, we've got the quote here from Alice Wilson, "Queer Joy Online is about happiness against insurmountable odds, and the creative freedom of being your own weird, gay, alone, angry, gleeful, insert your chosen descriptor self." Our participants told us they often find these moments of joy in the simplest experiences shared with others who understand their journey. So we might think of efforts to locate and to foster digital good in the present as a kind of prefigurative politics. These are modes of organisation and social relationships that strive to reflect the future society that is being sought out by a group. And in practice, they involve building a new society within the shell of the old. This is the sort of the language of prefigurative politics, by living out the values and social structures the group desires for the future. So prefigurative politics refers to how activists embody and enact within their activism the socialities, the practices that they want to foster for broader society. They are very often inspired by anarchist principles. The core practices characterizing prefiguration include participatory democracy, horizontality, direct action, inclusiveness. Some of these are central to what we focus on and how we do our work. So I think it's important then to sort of circle back to language here, to think here about the idea of equity in particular. So if we flip on to the next slide, please, Helen. We noted earlier that we focus our network's activity on three major societal challenges: resilience, sustainability, and equity. All of these terms are contested. They mean different things to different people. Some people are sick to death of hearing about them. Other people think they mean totally different things from one another. Resilience, for example, is a word that we in the network have had loads of conversation about. Our colleagues Abby Millings and Danielle Paddock, who are working as psychologists, thinking about the idea of resilience means something totally different than it might mean to someone like myself or Helen as a sociologist, science and technology studier, or a media and communication theorist. So these are all contested words. But one way that we operationalize the put aside is particularly through the idea of equity. So I want to focus on that one here today with the last moments of this webinar. So as a network, we began from a starting point that equity is something to strive for, that equity matters. And we talked for some time about the language to use. We use equality or equity, and we agreed eventually on equity for various different reasons. Probably most of us would want to strive for equity. At least we want it to be known that we would like to strive for equity. It sounds pretty good, doesn't it? But it also opens up more questions, I think, than it actually closes down. So equity is understood very often, I think, as a kind of dualism. The internet, for example, as a tool of in/equity. So Charlton McElwain's Black Software that Helen mentioned earlier, a great example of how productive this way of thinking can be. So his book describes how in the late decades of the 20th century, Black organisers and activists were actually really central to the internet's popular social development. They used that to further their community building and to develop political action. He then goes on to discuss how computing technology will become something quite different, a tool of oppression and disadvantage. So he describes, quote, two versions of black software, the kind that positively impacts Black people's lives, the kind that destroys them. So maybe the notion of ambivalence actually might be helpful for thinking about these multiple faces of inequity. So when it comes to equity, technologies might be understood as polyvalent. Helen already mentioned this idea of polyvocality. And I think the more that we move into the network's life, the more we think about how you actually manage analytically, empirically, the heterogeneity of our experiences in working with and through digital technologies. So we might think of technologies as being understood as polyvalent. How something appears more or less equitable depends entirely on your vantage point. So often it's determined by your social locations, which of course will be multiple and intersecting. But just as our biographies inform what we should research, they also inform our version of an equitable future. So indeed, we probably shouldn't just talk of equity, but rather multiple versions of equities, because we might all want equity, but we might all think about it in very distinctive ways. So recognizing this practically in the network, we need to ensure a breadth of lived experiences amongst our researchers. And with that, their ideas of what equity might actually look like. So remember the list of projects which explore the digital good from different perspectives mentioned earlier. Thanks, Helen. So exploring people's attitudes towards notions of the digital good in Dehenya, Queer Joy as Digital Good, the Afrofuturism Project. Another practical step for us in meeting to seek this objective of ensuring the expansion of our field from underrepresented groups. That's one of our key goals. How do we do that? This means we have to seek equity not only in what and how we research, but how we operate. So, for example, everything from ring fencing funding, highlighting notes in where we have gaps in our research portfolio, paying attention to who is in and who is represented in the digital good network. Doing all of this is very difficult, it's very ambitious, it's much harder than a less inclusive approach would be, but it's perhaps an example of the prefigurative political mode in action, trying to generate present shifts that emulate futures we wish for. So I think that covers a great deal of ground of some of the thinking we've been developing over the lifetime of the network. But I'll just jump into a couple of concluding thoughts before we draw it to a close for some discussion and questions. The first one is a question about whether equity is possible. What would it look like if we had this equitable situation? One reflection I think it would be useful to offer is the idea of category errors. I think the question of whether equity is possible might actually be a category error. I think increasingly of equity as a heuristic, the word that Helen mentioned earlier, a means of generating the deliberation that helps us shape the boundaries of what is desirable. And in a sense, all of our core terms are heuristics. They're tools, perhaps imperfect, that catalyze thinking, sometimes action towards something. Hope, anticipation, imagination, equity are ongoing, collectively undertaken processes that do not necessarily reach an endpoint. However, once we say these are our chosen words / terms / focus, it's possible for them to function. Well, is it possible really for them to function as anything other than heuristics, I guess is the question. Do they become heuristics in the act of us sort of deciding that they are our focus? So given that the digital good network is interdisciplinary, it might also be pertinent to ask which disciplines are more open to hope, imagining, prefiguring desired futures. I know certainly from our experience of working in the networks, I think here Dan Richards and Kim Snooks, who are part of our management team, who are design orientated researchers, who have a very different and I think much more sort of courageous outlook towards the idea of trying to imagine the future than I, for example, as a sociologist who has been trained disciplinarily to think about empirical evidence in front of me and critiquing it rather than imagining what alternatives there might be. Whereas people like Dan and Kim have actually got much more kind of nimbleness and pliability for doing that, perhaps because of their disciplinary orientation. Which disciplines need to be able to come together to do that, to envision better digital futures. We might think of the Centre for Socio-Digital Futures at Bristol with Susan Holford leading it, which presents a really interesting attempt to get the disciplinary mix right, and you should definitely check them out. Design, engineering, other solution-orientated disciplines, which also kind of critical social sciences should we invoke as well. They're very, very good at critiquing political theory, from which the notion of prefigurative politics emerges. Should they be involved in the conversation as well? Others end with, I think, a really useful reflection from Sarah Pink, who argues that we need a new interdisciplinary, futures-oriented social science that exceeds existing critique. It must rethink expertise, our own situatedness, and our own interventional capabilities. And I think that hopefully will give us a really interesting starting point for a conversation. So thanks ever so much for listening to me and Helen today, and I'll mute myself now.
Thank you very much, Ros. I've stopped sharing slides and we can move into any questions or comments or observations from anybody in the audience. I don't know if Ruth or Dee want to kind of direct our attention to questions out there.
Hi, Helen. Yes, we do have one question to start with. So Anuradha from the audience has said, as a doctoral researcher whose project is on digital good, I would love to hear if you have any thoughts or reflections on the emerging methods or methodological innovations for the field of the digital good, i.e. not researching the past, but anticipating hopeful possibilities.
Great question. I guess we might both have something to say and possibly different things to say. So shall I give it a go, Ros, and then hand over to you? So emerging methods, methodologies, methodological innovations for the field of the digital good. A couple of things. We are methodologically agnostic, I would say, on the Digital Good Network. We don't have any preconceived ideas about what the best or right methods for addressing our overarching research question should be. However, it doesn't surprise me that a lot of the projects that we've funded or a lot of the work that we've undertaken has had quite a participatory action research kind of orientation or characteristic, precisely because of some of the things that me and Ros were talking about, which is that we can't have one view of the digital good and we can't have one top-down view of what a good digital society looks like. We need to talk to lots of people. We need to hear what they have to say. We need to talk especially to those people who might be more negatively affected by the introduction of some new digital tech or other. So we find that there is a lot of that type of work within the network. We're sort of keen to be inclusive of methods. So Ros mentioned highlight notes. Sometimes they are around questions of equity, but sometimes in some occasions we've sort of highlighted our encouraging the use of more quantitative methods because we haven't seen that many represented in the work that we're doing so far. And then I would finally flag our colleague Scott Hale is in our core management team. He's our emerging methodologies coordinator. So if you're in the audience, Scott, please speak up. But if not, to say on Scott's behalf, I mean he does a lot of work experimenting with computational methods and how they might be deployed to answer research questions about the kind of digital society that we want. He's looking at the moment of the use of AI in messaging apps, and I can't tell you much more than that because I'm not an expert in the methods that he uses. Ros, is there anything you'd want to add to that answer?
I'd probably just actually also just highlight Anuradha's attention to the recent building blocks and reflexive questions document that we pulled together. This is a really interesting document. I've just put it in the chat, Anuradha, and maybe you've seen it already, but it was compiled over a number of months by a kind of a large group of us within the network who were in part sort of synthesizing a lot of the Digital Good Network funded research. So we also have the Digital Good Research Fund, which is when Helen and I were referring to the highlight note. If you go onto our website, you'll see and learn about the Digital Good Research Fund. And there's a highlight note portion there where we flag methodologies that we think are currently absent from our portfolio and other disciplines and things like that. And in the research fund, we've funded now probably the better part of £1 million worth of research, asking questions about the digital good. And this document compiles a lot of the thinking from that, alongside other thinking that's been happening in the network as well. And one of the things I think that is really interesting that transpires out of that is the idea of methods themselves being digital good methods, which very often are, as Helen mentions, those that are participatory. in their nature that draw in multiplicity of voices. When we as sociologists think about participatory methods, I think we have a really particular set of ideas about what those methods look like. So it'd be like participatory action research would be predominantly qualitative. I think a really interesting provocation would be, what would a kind of a quantitatively driven method that was also participatory in its orientation look like? Don't know the answer to that question, but I'm really interested in this idea of methods themselves being digital good methods, and how we might actually play around with our sort of standard methodological repertoires in our various disciplines and make them so that they are more heterogeneous, more polyvocal, more polyvalent in their approach to thinking about the multiplicity of experiences of technology. So I suppose for me, Anuradha, that it would be a point of just kind of directing you towards that document and challenging you, particularly in your own doctoral research, to think about how your methods can be made even more pliable toward that end. Shall I jump in on a couple more questions here, Helen, that have come in? I think Dan has, full disclosure, Dan Richards is one of the co-Is on the network, and is, in a typical Dan sense, offered a very provocative question in the question and answer. Hi, Dan, I didn't realise you were here. It's good to see you, see your name. Dan's asked us to share some reflections on what we feel and we've personally learned about the digital good in this process as directors of the network. Has anything surprised us, shifted our perspective on this agenda in the past 2 years? Maybe whilst Helen reflects on that, I'll just say very briefly, my perspective has shifted. And before, I think when we started, I wasn't quite sure whether any of this will be possible, and particularly the idea of arriving at something better than we began with. I didn't know whether it'd be possible. I think now that it is possible, so perhaps maybe my optimism has shifted. And I think actually, Dan, that is because of engaging with different disciplines who think, yeah, this isn't a question that we shouldn't be asking. This is absolutely a question we should be asking together. And so I think there is a certain level of openness that as a trained sociologist who did an undergraduate and a master's and a PhD in sociology, I just didn't have to the idea of thinking toward the future and thinking about the possible futures that we might, as a kind of an interdisciplinary mix, be able to generate. But now I think it is possible. The question is how we get there together. And I think that's what the next couple of years of the network are going to be, particularly through mechanisms like the Digital Good Index, which you guys can learn more about by looking on our website. Helen?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, great question. Thanks, Dan. I think I have, so the question is, what have I personally learned? I've learned about some concepts and some notions that I didn't know much about before. I mentioned some of them, Ubuntu, Buen Vivir, for example. I've learned about some tech phenomena, some actual, material technologies that I didn't know much about before. So thinking about a project about co-designing an app in Brazil that allows people to choose what sort of social initiatives they might donate to, and how to stop the choices from being kind of algorithmically determined, to present them in a more fair way. That's one example. Fair phones, which one of our current projects looking at sustainable Internet of Things is sort of talking about as one aspect of their work. So some actual technologies that might be better technologies for our society I've learned about. And I would say, reflecting on the digital good, I knew it was contested. Maybe I've thought more about those contestations, or become more aware of the breadth of them. Would I use that phrase again if I was in the position again of putting in a bid like this? Is it better to talk about better rather than good? I think some people are alienated by the concept of good for some of the reasons that I described, and especially some groups, communities, actors, researchers, thinkers who I would really want to be having a conversation with. So my mind is kind of open about the extent of the value of the terminology that we're using. I mean, I still think it was the right thing to do, and it is achieving what we set out to achieve but I can also see that it might close the door to some people that I would want to have in the conversation. Shall we now move to the next question from Les, which I haven't read yet. So I don't know, Ros, if you've had any time to think about this. So the question is, alongside critical analysis of framing the good, it's necessary likewise for framing the digital within the wider concept of technological design. It is always socio-technical, yet the social is generally preempted and obscured. What concepts and methods can help to open up the social and digital? Do you have any thoughts on that, Ros?
It's a great question, isn't it? I think we do. We begin from no, I don't think we begin from a presumption that we're all settled on what the digital is, but to some extent, we do, I think, treat it as more settled than our ideas of the good. Like the digital is an object of study that more or less we sort of all are on the same page about, and perhaps that is a presumption that we should be holding more in check than we do, Helen. Obviously, Les, I know, kind of from well-known science and technology studies scholar yourself will know that whole kind of body of literature within science and technology studies that does draw our attention to how we define technological artifacts, what the boundaries of a technological artifact is, if it can actually be bounded, if it actually is, and if it's an assemblage of different actors within and beyond the object itself. And I perhaps think, Helen, we could perhaps orientate ourselves towards more thinking around that, particularly because we do make those assumptions, I think, as a starting point in things like the Digital Good Research Fund, where we do ask people about building the good with technologies. There maybe is a presumption there about what these technologies are as a starting point that we could perhaps challenge ourselves more about, Helen.
Yeah, I agree. I think we spend a lot of time focusing on the term good, but we should also think about the term digital and think about the term society, which also came up in a talk that me and Ros gave earlier in the year. And actually we responded to a call for a digital society network plus. And I think within that whole kind of framing kind of infrastructure, we weren't really invited to question what was meant by digital and what was meant by society. But I think, yeah, an openness and a reflectiveness about those terms is important as well. I would say that I think we are open about what we consider the digital to be, and I think this came up in the review process. So when you submit your application, you get to see what reviewers have to say, and so someone kind of questioned our openness towards the digital, and one of the reviewers said that it's too broad, and then we should be narrowing it down and thinking about a set of technologies. But we wanted to propose something quite ambitious, which seemed like the right thing to do with a significant amount of taxpayers' money that was being channeled into the Network Plus, which was to think about whether we can abstract general principles and values about a good digital society and not be saying, well, AI must be like this and social media content moderation must be like that. So I think that openness is there. But yeah, I sort of take the point of being more reflective. Shall I move on to the next question? We have 6 minutes left and a couple of questions. So a question from Johnny, a final year PhD student. Do you have any advice for getting over the barriers of thinking about the future when you're in a traditional discipline that's not used to thinking about the future? As Ros said, people have been trained in disciplines like sociology to look for empirical evidence. Well, I would say that, two kind of examples that Ros quoted that are doing really great work. One is the Centre for Socio-Digital Futures, which is led by Susan Halford, who's a sociologist, but she's got a long history of trying really hard to work with engineers and computer scientists and bringing those diverse disciplines together to think about the future. So I would look at their work and what they're doing. And another person that Ros cited is Sarah Pink, who I think she's an anthropologist by training, but is really good at challenging the social sciences lack of engagement with the future. And what she says is then we are being left out of the conversation. So I would look at her work, and I think she's got some amazing centre or multiple centres in Australia, sort of focusing on these questions. I would turn to them. So should we take this question from M? Shall I read it out and give you a chance to answer it, Ros, unless you wanted to add to the question from Johnny?
Yeah, maybe just quickly on Johnny's point. I don't think, Johnny, that you need to sort of reinvent a wheel as well. You know, thinking about your work and the orientation you strike towards the work you've already done. Like you could, for example, end a paper with the sort of the critical thrust of what your paper is. So, well, this is everything that is wrong with what I've come across and what I've found through this evidence, right? That you could put the full stop at the end of that. It's another decision to open up a new paragraph and think, right, okay, well, based on that, what next then? What would be better? What would a better future look like based upon what we already know here? What would the contours of that be? Or what would some starting points be? And I think that there is a decision that we very often make. And you describe sort of traditional disciplines. I mean, there are a whole range of different disciplines, many of them much better, I think, at doing this than certainly I am, or certainly I was trained to be as a sociologist, particularly. Which think I'm not talking here just about sort of like mundane things like recommendations, but actually like, well, what's the political thrust of this for the future? What's that prefigurative politics then that you could enact in the present to enable that future to happen? You could finish a paper with a reflection on that. That wouldn't be a bad thing, and that wouldn't take you so far away from needing to kind of comply to all those things you need to comply to as an early career researcher as well, like getting your publications out and that kind of thing. Just a couple of thoughts to add to that. Yes, and I see the next question, Helen, is from M, who's asking us about frameworks and projects specifically designed for the third sector to help reduce the digital divide. Many charities struggle to balance the embracement of digital technologies for social good and the education of digital risks. Thanks for educating. You got any thoughts on that, Helen? I'll just share Cast's link in the chat.
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant question that it's hard to talk about in 3 minutes. And if you'd asked that at the beginning, we could have spoken about that for an hour. And Ros alluded to a piece of work we're doing, which is seeking to produce what we are calling a digital good index, which is kind of mechanisms for evaluating the societal benefits of digital technologies. So not an output for academics, but for practitioners in the world to think about, how to ensure that technologies they develop or deploy or regulate or govern have good societal outcomes. And in doing that, we've done a little bit of reviewing of existing frameworks. There are loads, like how you categorize them. Is it a framework? Is it guidance? Is it a toolkit? You know, what is it? Is it tools? What's it purporting to be? So that there are some out there, and I think we're about to share all the kind of background work that we've done more publicly, maybe sort of make it transparent, have a more transparent database on this topic. So I would say in terms of our work, watch this space, maybe subscribe to our mailing list. I bet there was a final slide saying subscribe to our mailing list, but I've stopped sharing the slides. Hopefully Dee and Ruth can put that in the chat for more on that. But I think it is a really important question. I think there is an absolute minefield of guidance out there, and it can be quite difficult for charities to navigate, like what is valuable to me, what is not valuable to me. But Ros, do you want to say something about the link that you've put in? You're going to put a link to CAST in there.
Yeah, I've just mentioned an organisation, CAST, who work with charities to engage with technologies in and digital technologies in their work. Dan Such, who's a part of CAST, is a part of our College of Experts and is quite closely engaged with the network. So it might be an interesting starting point for you sort of digging into that area a little bit more. The link is in the chat on the Zoom.
Great. I think that we are at time, a perfect amount of questions, really fantastic questions. Thank you so much. I hope it was an enjoyable experience to join this webinar. As our colleagues Dee and Ruth are saying in the chat, please join our mailing list and you can find out about other things that we're doing and ways to engage with the work that we are doing going forward. Thank you so much for coming today, folks. Thank you, Ros. Thank you, Ruth and Dee, for being in the background, making sure that everything works smoothly, and hope to engage with you all again sometime soon.